If you do have your Bibles, if you'll turn to Genesis chapter 50 in verse 20, that'll be our text verse today. The sermon's going to be a little bit different. The title itself leaves a lot to the imagination. I was working on what would I call this sermon? What would I title this sermon? And this seemed to be the best title for it. This is what after several hours of careful consideration, I came to the conclusion, nothing's better than something. This is what I titled the sermon this morning. This sermon is about the future of your story. That is what the whole sermon's about. It's about the future of your story, and I promise you, I do not know what that is. I have no clue. I don't know what's coming in your life. I don't know what's coming in my life. I couldn't tell you the future of my own story. But this sermon is about the future of your story. But I can tell you that the outcome of your story is based on the title of this message. I do know that for sure. The title is just 3 dots, which indicates an ellipsis. That is what this is called. Now, if you didn't know that the 3 dots on the page is called an ellipsis, you just gain knowledge. This day is not wasted. You have learned something new. The 3 dots on the page is called an ellipsis. It's the act of leaving out words that aren't really necessary for the phrase to be understood. This happened and ... and this happened, and you don't need, it's basically another way to say, making a long story short, ... It takes this part and it bridges them together. But sometimes it can be used to create curiosity also. An ellipsis is a really, really neat tool when you're writing. You can create curiosity or you can make a long story short. It's a really, really awesome feature when you're writing. Because the information that belongs in this spot it's how you get from the first part of the story to the last part of the story. Let me give you an example. I ran into Phil Boyer in the store. Now I own 4,700 cans of green beans. In between those 2 statements is a ... I ran into Phil Boyer at the store. ... Now I own 4,700 cans of green beans. That ... right there did not explain what was going on in the story, but boy, did it pique your curiosity. What happened at the store? By the way, that's not a true story, so you're leaving with the curiosity on that one. I don't even know what happened. I just know hypothetically, I own a lot of green beans. So if you're hypothetically in need of green beans, hypothetically, come talk to me. What it does is it creates curiosity. You can create curiosity. You can fill in the blanks of the 2 at the beginning of the story and the end of the story with just this ellipsis. It's a powerful writing tool. It takes no skill at all. Everybody knows how to spell it. I mean, it's really easy to put on a page. But it's a creative way to tell the story. What happens during the ellipsis answers the question, how did you get from where you are or where you were to where you are now? The ellipsis carries the information to the beginning and to the end of the story. Let me put an example on the screen, the one I want to use this morning in Scripture. Let's look at the example. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. ... And they all lived happily together for the remainder of their lives. Sure they did. There's a lot happening in those 3 little dots. There's a lot of story that's been omitted from that statement. The statement's absolutely true, but now you say, okay, he was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then at the end of that ellipsis, it says they lived happily together for the remainder of their lives. Yeah, I don't think so. No way. If that was my story, like, hey, by the way, your family sold you into slavery. Oh, okay. How you doing? Oh, we're happy. We're living happily together. No, there's a portion of that story that needs to be explained. But what happened during those 3 dots tells us everything. The ... really does help save space on the page. You can write a long story in a little space with that ... But if the first part and the last part of the statement fail to give enough information so you can understand what happened in the ellipsis, we're left with a lot of questions. We're left with a lot of questions. How can you move forward with understanding if you never fill in the blanks? What do you do there? If you don't fill in the blanks of this is what happened, if you don't fill in the blanks, the end is going to look a lot like the beginning. You've got to do something with the ellipsis. You've got to do something with the ... Today, I hope to help everyone recognize the importance of understanding the ... or the ellipsis in our own lives. It's a really, really important part of our lives. First, let's look at Joseph's story and fill in the blanks. I mean, the story looked terrible at the beginning. Hey, he sold into slavery and they were all happily ever after. Let's fill in the ellipsis here. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 2. In this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flocks with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. In these two verses, we see that Joseph is only a teenager. It says right there he's 17 years old. He's only a teenager, and he has a very, very good relationship with his father. We can pick all that out of there. He's just 17 years old. He has a really good relationship with dad. He's loved, and he still has a lot to learn about life because he is at a young age. He's only 17 years old. Since Joseph's story is 13 chapters long, I am going to use a lot of ... this morning because I know there's football games, there's lunch, there's other things you want to do with life also. So I'm going to put a lot of ... here. We're just going to hit the highlights. Joseph has a good life and godly parents, and he has a heart that wants to please the Lord. That's when the hurt and the struggles show up right at the beginning of the story here. Chapter after chapter, we see Joseph suffer through circumstances he did not deserve. There's no place in the story where we can say, yeah, he had that coming. He does not deserve anything that goes on through the next 13 chapters. It one circumstance after another. It's just a rough road that Joseph has to go down. His brothers hated him because he was daddy's favorite. That's it. If you have siblings, they have their version of you, and you can tell your version of them. You were mom's favorite, or you were dad's favorite, and the truth is, your parents loved you and your siblings too. I can go ahead and tell that story also. I have siblings. I have brothers and a sister, and I can say, oh yeah, they were definitely mom and dad's favorite. Well, in this case, the Bible tells us that his father loved Joseph more than all the other children. So, yeah, Joseph was dad's favorite. It's a given. Joseph is dad's favorite here, and his brothers hate him because he's dad's favorite. They take him, they throw him in a pit, and then they do the unimaginable. Look at verse 28 of Genesis 37. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. I have experienced sibling rivalry before. I've been there. I've experienced this. And I may have even joked about selling my siblings. Maybe. Hypothetically, that may have happened. But to actually do it would be something I could never bring myself to do. I have an opportunity. I could actually sell my sibling. The opportunity's right in front of me. I would not be able to do that. I could joke about it, but I wouldn't be able to do this. Joseph's brothers actually did it. They took their brother and sold him. Everything Joseph knew and loved was taken away from him at the beginning of the story here. They really sold their brother into slavery. He didn't know what was going to happen, but that day was the last time he was going to see any of his family for the next 22 years. That's a big event. They actually sold him, and he's gone for a couple decades. He doesn't get to see any of his family for the next 22 years. He did nothing to deserve it. He was just Dad's favorite. It was Dad's actions that made the brothers mad at Joseph, not Joseph's actions. Now, Joseph did share that he got some dreams, and he did explain to his brothers, which only added fuel to the fire. We don't like you already, and now your dreams seem to indicate that you think you're better than us. It's time to sell little brother. And they did it. They sold him. 22 years, he's gone. He is 17 years old and torn from everything he loves. That's rough. That's a rough beginning of the story. Most people would not only be angry at the brothers, they would be angry at God also. I mean, how do you justify this? What do you do? Joseph would have been hurt, confused, and lonely. Everybody's gone. I have no way back. My brothers actually sold me. It's not an expression. They really did it. They sold me into slavery. He would have had his sense of value would have dropped immediately. Oh, my own family. Okay, I'm depressed. By the way, I don't have any reason to think that Joseph wasn't depressed. That would be a depressing event. But then matters get worse. The Midianites who bought him from the brothers only saw him for the purpose of financial gain. That's the only value Joseph has in his new situation. Look at verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Joseph had no value with his brothers, and now he experiences it again with the Midianites. Like, okay, my brothers didn't see any value in me. What are you guys going to do? Oh, we just need to find a person that wants to buy you. Isn't that what my brothers just did? I still have no value. None. He's sold to an Egyptian officer named Potiphar. And this is where he begins to find a sense of belonging. At least there's a little bit of hope here. He's at least, it's a new home. It's not the same as the old home, but at least he's got some sense of belonging in this one. Potiphar really liked Joseph. He put him in the authority over everything he owned. Joseph was honorable, and finally he was loved again. That's great. The problem was that Potiphar's wife really liked Joseph too. Now you got a speed bump. What do you mean she liked him? Well, she really liked him. Potiphar's wife. Now we've got an obstacle coming. She tries to seduce Joseph, and he refuses her advances. She grabs his coat as he's running away. He slips out of his coat and leaves because he realizes what she's doing, and he knows this would not be honorable to God, and it wouldn't be honorable to his master Potiphar. So he leaves the scene, and he slips out of his own coat because she's holding on to that, and he leaves without his coat. Joseph's done nothing wrong, but Mrs. Potiphar is mad because she didn't get her way. So she ends up using his garment to frame him. When Potiphar comes back, she says, Joseph tried to take advantage of me, and when I screamed, he ran off and he left this garment behind. Here's the evidence that what I say is true. And Potiphar gets mad. Look at verse 19 of chapter 39. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Joseph has been torn away from his father, and now he's torn away from what appeared to be an acceptable alternative. At least we can make this work. Now he's torn away from what seemed to be a little bit of hope. Remember, he still hasn't done anything to deserve this. He's actually honoring God the whole way. He ran away from Potiphar's wife because he wanted to honor God. He remains in prison for 3 years. He's forgotten in prison. He's just gone. Completely forgotten. Now, this could make somebody extremely bitter. I mean, just look at Joseph's story from beginning all the way to this point. I could see that I would have a lot of potential to be really bitter at this point. And I think most of us could agree that would probably, make us unhappy at the least. But bitter is probably where we would end up. Why would God allow this? Why did his brothers hate him so much? He didn't do anything wrong. Why did his brothers hate him so much? Why was Potiphar's wife so selfish? Why did all of this have to affect him, a person that's trying to live for God? Joseph was going through a 22-year-long bitter chapter of life. That's just where he's at. Now, ... We're just going to plug it in here. ... Eventually, he's released from prison and placed second in command over Egypt. God speaks to him and tells him that there is a 7-year famine coming. And Joseph plans ahead, and he gets enough food for all of Egypt and the surrounding countries for the 7-year famine. He's got enough there. He stores it up. So when that famine hits, Joseph's wisdom answered everybody's problems, because even though we don't have food, there's still food available because of what Joseph did. His brothers don't live in Egypt, but they do find out that in Egypt there's some food stored up. So Joseph's brothers, 22 years later, say, hey, that's where our answer is. We can find food there. Let's go to Egypt. So they go to Egypt for help. And this is where they run into Joseph, who now holds a very powerful position. But 22 years can change a person, and they don't recognize their little brother. They don't realize that they're talking to Joseph. This is where revenge has finally found its opportunity in the story. Joseph has power. His brothers come for help. Revenge has presented an opportunity. Here you go, Joseph. Here you go. He can have them executed if he wants to. And why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't you? You can have them put to death right now for what they did to you. A lot of bitterness can develop when you realize that you have been robbed of 22 years of a good life. A lot can build up there. So revenge is sitting right there in front of Joseph. There's a lot that goes on in this part of the story, but I want to skip to Joseph's outlook in the end. ... Here's another one. You're welcome. He's speaking to his brothers who have hated him without cause. This is his response to his brothers. Genesis 50 and verse 20, our text verse. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Let me break this story down in another way. Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers. He is left with a very low sense of value because of what they did. He's framed and he's thrown into prison. ... He tells his brothers how God used it all to bless them. What? And that really is what's going on here. Hey, God did all this. He let all this happen to save your lives, guys. Isn't that great? No, that is not great. Did you forget about the 22 years, Joseph? Did you forget about what they have coming because of what they did? Didn't forget about any of it, because he remembered all of it. And he said that what you meant as evil against me, God meant it for good. And he saved your lives. He saved so many lives because of this event. This is one of the Bible's most shocking stories. I mean, we see a lot of awesome stories in the Bible, but this one blows me away. How did Joseph learn to respond to such hostility in such a loving way? How do you do that? How do you do that? It all happened during the ... It all happened during the ellipsis. What occurs during the ellipsis is what explains the end result of the story. The beginning of the story, we can have it there. The ... tells us why the end of the story looks the way it does. A lot happens in this little tiny space on the page. Let me show you what was happening during the ellipsis. Let me show you what was happening during Joseph's story. Sold into slavery by his brothers, sold into slavery again by the Midianites. Ends up in a household where he thinks there's at least some hope, and then he's framed by the wife, thrown into prison and forgotten. Now he stands the second in power over the world power. His brothers show up, revenge presents an opportunity, and Joseph says, hey, what you meant for evil, God meant, and he saved your life. Isn't that a great story? What happens here in the ellipsis is what gives us the answer of how Joseph went from that horrible beginning of the story to the answer he responded to his brothers with. Look at these two verses, Genesis 39 verse 2 and 39 verse 21. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Through every dark turn, Joseph never forsook his relationship with God. You're still with me, even though everybody else is not. You're still with me. How was he able to show grace to the very people who deserved judgment? How did he do it? Because boy, would that be a good answer to have, wouldn't it? I'm guessing everybody in here gets along with everybody else that you ever run into in life. But I sometimes have issues. What do you do? What do you do in this scenario in our own lives when people deserve judgment? They have it coming. What they did was wrong. What do you do to get to the point where you can show grace like Joseph did for people who actually deserve judgment? Joseph could have remained bitter with his brothers for how they behaved. He absolutely could have done it. The way they behaved at the beginning of the story. But he chose to do something different instead. He left the beginning of the story behind so he could experience the ellipsis. That's the secret. That's the secret. If you never leave the beginning of the story behind, you will end up dragging it with you through the rest of your life. Joseph, I don't understand the wisdom and the person, the character of Joseph is amazing to me. But the beginning of the story was hard, and Joseph says, I've got to walk away from the beginning of the story so I can experience the ellipsis. Because if I hold on to the beginning of the story, I will drag it all the way through the rest of my story. I've got to let that go so I can experience the ... I want to do that. If we choose to remain invested in what happens when things go wrong, then the end of our story will resemble those same things. Well, how they said these bad things happened at the beginning of their life. They died a desperate and lonely person. Why? Because of all the things that happened at the beginning of the story. What you have done is you have taken the beginning of your story and you have painted the rest of your story with those events. Joseph decided, I've got to leave the beginning of the story behind so I can experience the ellipsis. Because what happens in that time period determines the end of my story. If I hold on to the beginning of the story, that is what will determine the end of my story. And he chose to leave it behind. We never, ever move forward if we hold on to the beginning of the story. We end the story in the same place the hard time started. That's what we end up doing. The ... is the most important part of your story. Like, I thought the end was the most important. No, the end is determined by the ... What about the beginning? That's just the beginning of the story. What happens during the ellipsis is what's going to determine the end result of your story. If we never get past the hurt or the hardships, our final chapter will be written including the hurt and the hardships. I don't know about you, but I like the happy ending version. I really would like that. I like that idea. Joseph could have become bitter towards his brothers and he could have stayed there. And a lot of people do that. They become bitter towards the people that hurt them. They become bitter towards the mistreatment or the pain that person put onto their life. And they stay right there. No, I can't forgive you. I can't get past this. And they live the rest of their life holding on to that, which actually decorates the rest of their life. That's all they're doing with that. This is how most people would have responded to Joseph's story. I'm going to hold on to that. I will never, ever forgive what you've done to me. But Joseph decided to invest his time in something different. He trusted God, that God would lead him through the ellipsis. God, you're still with me. Let's go ahead and do this part together. Look at Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 3. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. This is where Joseph finds himself. This is where I'm going to be. He was either going to become defined by the hurtful actions or behaviors of his brothers, or he was going to allow God to write the next part of his story. It was his choice. I will be defined by that, or I'm going to hand the pen over to God. God, you can start writing from here, because I don't like what I would write based on how the story began. I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to trust you. Most people would have spent the next couple of decades plotting revenge. Joseph turned that responsibility over to God. Look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 19. It says, Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. When people hurt us or anger us in some way, we usually lose ourselves in that event. I've done it. I know you've probably done it too. We lose ourselves in that event. Joseph decided to lose himself in his relationship with God instead. He wins. Better call. That was the right move. He did what needed to be done. And I think we can all agree that he was going through some pretty rough times, some really dark times in his life. I think we can all look at that and go, yeah, that wasn't good. That was a bad event. It's hard to wrap our minds around actually living through what Joseph actually lived through. It's hard to put ourselves in his place and comprehend what he was going through. God did great things in the life of Joseph. He exalted Egypt. He gave him the ability to interpret dreams. He brought Joseph to power, and he saved all 12 tribes of Israel at one time. God used Joseph in some incredible ways. All that is how Joseph's story ended. But it would have never ended this way if Joseph wouldn't have yielded the ... portion of his life over to God. We would be reading a totally different account. But what we read, like, wow, look at what God did. Look at what God did. But we can't, even though we can give God all credit, we have to go ahead and recognize what Joseph did. If Joseph wouldn't have given the ... portion of life over to God, we would have a different story. But he did. He said, God, a lot of bad's happened. You go ahead and take the pen. You need to write the ellipsis. I need you to write what happens here. Even though the book of 1 Peter did not exist during Joseph's life, he had a pretty good understanding of what Peter was writing about. And he did a pretty good job of applying it. Even though it happens centuries later, look at what Peter writes and look at how Joseph applied that same idea to his life. 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. The word sanctify in this verse means to set apart as holy. As holy. It means to honor and respect the Lord with your hearts. It says sanctify the Lord in God in your hearts. You are holy. I'm not going to get lost in the circumstances. I'm not going to get lost in the hurt. I'm going to get lost in you. I'm going to get lost in you. That's what Joseph decided to do. When we live sanctified, when we sanctify the Lord in our hearts, when we get to the place where we can do that, we live with a good conscience, knowing that he will take care of everything if we just turn it over to him. He's going to write it with us. We're included. He's going to write the story. And when we desire to honor God with our existence, God is free to design the ... portion of our lives. But we have to sanctify our hearts. Hey, God, all the bad's happening. I'm going to keep my eyes here instead of here. I'm going to let you write the ellipsis. We don't get stuck in the dark chapters of our lives that way. Instead, we shine the light back into the darkness. That's where our story really gets amazing. Look at Matthew 5 and verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. What purpose would light have if it is not or was not to illuminate in the darkness? Can you give me any purpose for light? Not warmth, light. If it is not to illuminate the darkness. That is the purpose of light. Otherwise, there is no purpose. God does allow us to go through dark times, but He is never intended to leave us there. He never wants to leave us there. He asks us rather to be a light in the darkness. I'm going to let you go through dark times. Why? So when you get to this side, you can shine that light right back into it. What you meant for evil, God brought me through so He could save much people. You shine the light back into the darkness. You can either be defined by the darkness, or you can let God use the darkness as a time where you can illuminate and be a blessing to somebody else's life and bring them to Him. We get that choice, though. We absolutely get that choice. That means we have to determine to let God have full liberty to walk us through the ... You get to do this, God. I'm not gonna hang on to the beginning of the story. Don't ever put your hook in the beginning of the story and then start traveling. Don't do that. I've done that before, and I'm telling you, nothing changed. Nothing changed. Every chapter of my life was still that same story, that same event, because I drug it with me all the way through. It wasn't until I realized I need to let go of this and then experience the ellipsis. Let God do something in the ellipsis. That changed everything. Now the end of my story is going to look a whole lot different than it was before. Everything's changing here. When David was being hunted by his enemies, go to the Old Testament, see when David's being hunted by his enemies, he wrote a psalm which helps us see why God referred to him as a man after God's own heart. Psalms 31 and verse 3 says, "For you are my rock and my fortress. Therefore, for your name's sake, lead me and guide me." Wait a second, what's going on here, David? I'm getting lost in the person of Jesus Christ. I'm getting lost in the relationship with God. Instead of getting lost in the circumstances that I'm being hunted, I'm going to lose myself in my relationship with God. And he says, now I need you for your name's sake, not for mine, but for your name's sake, would you please lead me and guide me? David was running for his life. He could have been bitter towards the people that were hunting him down, absolutely. But instead he asked the Lord to fill the ... part of his life for his own name's sake. I'm going to turn it over to you, God. Would you please fill in the blank? Satan would love nothing more than to see us get stuck in the dark chapters of life. And maybe you're going through one of those right now. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, I'm still not comfortable with the message. I don't like this because I'm going through a lot of hurt right now, and to just walk away from it and let it go is going to be hard to do because I'm still wrapped up emotionally in that dark time. Well, and I'm not saying that just stop it. Yeah, that's really easy to say. Look, just stop it. See, I did it again. It was super easy to say. It's a lot harder to do. I've been there too. I got to let the dark times go. I've got to walk away from the hurt. I've got to walk away from it. And it does take time sometimes to let that go because we're so wrapped up in it. But if you do not let it go, it will be the end of your story also. You've got to walk away from the beginning of the story and let God write the ellipsis. We've got to do that. Satan wants you to get stuck in the dark times. He absolutely wants you to, because when you do this, you become calloused and you become unkind. You seek justice over righteousness. It happens. I've been there. Guilty. It happens. Maybe we should just stop and understand that people will sometimes let us down. It's going to happen. Sometimes people are going to let us down, but we don't need to give them the power to change the ellipsis of our story. Yeah, you let me down. You know what? I've probably done the same to somebody else. or probably will. We do that. We're people and we do that. But I can't give this situation or you the power to change the ellipsis. This is an event that happened. I'm just going to do one thing that's really unheard of. It's a really radical move. Here's some love and grace and joy. I've got an ellipsis to experience. That's exactly what Joseph did. Yeah, my brothers hated me and they sold me into slavery. They wanted to kill me. At least they didn't do that. But they still ruined my life. And at the end of the story, Joseph makes an incredible statement. What you meant for evil, God used an ellipsis and meant for good. Incredible story. Incredible story. God's the one we should give the pen to. God, I'm hurt, I'm suffering, I'm bitter, I'm angry, I don't know how to forgive them. Can you write this part? Because it's going to look bad if I do it. God, I'm going to turn this over to you and I'm going to trust you. For your name's sake, will you write the ellipsis? Will you write it? Events are going to occur in life. It's really going to happen. And sometimes they're good events and sometimes they're really difficult. That's just what we call life. It does happen. What happens after the event determines the outcome of the story. The event is the event. What happens after the event determines the outcome of the story. So often people face traumatic experiences and the rest of their lives are defined by those experiences. They need counseling. They go into deep depression. Sometimes they're suicidal. Why are you suicidal? Do you have no value? I don't have value because I defined myself by the beginning of the story. Unhook it. Unhook it. That was the event. Enjoy the ellipsis. That event God can use for greater things, but you need to disconnect yourself from the beginning of the story and go enjoy the ellipsis. Enjoy the ellipsis. People make drastic decisions or redefine their sense of value because of hard times. And I talk to people all the time who go through this. What they don't understand is that the hurt is not their story. It's just how the story began. That was the beginning of their story. What they do with the ellipsis is what determines the end of their story. And I don't know where everybody's sitting today as far as in your life. I don't know where you stand in life right now. I don't know what you're going through. I know with a crowd this size, there's a good possibility that there's a lot of hurt going on. There's struggles. Maybe it's in relationships. Maybe it's in not understanding why you're in a position you are and why God allowed it. I don't know what the scenario is, but I do know that's the beginning of that story. That's not the final result of that story. It's time to say, I'm gonna pour love and grace on this, and I'm going to go live the ellipsis. I'm going to move from the beginning. I'm going to disconnect myself from the event, and I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to let God rewrite the story. I'm going to let Him explain what the ellipsis looks like. Joseph revealed the greatest decision possible when he told his brothers how he got to where he was. Genesis 50:20, again, let's look at this verse one more time. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Wouldn't it be incredible if we all took our traumatic events and told Satan, you meant evil against me, but I turned the ellipsis over to God, and He meant it for good. Oh, that would ruin Satan's book. That would ruin his book. Sorry, we can't publish that. It's garbage. Turns out the real story turned out really good. We're going to go ahead and get this one forward. We'll move this one forward. We can either allow our past to redefine us, or we can allow God to use it to transform us. It is your call. It's your call. The ellipsis is where you are right now. So at the beginning of this sermon, I said, this sermon is about your future, and I don't even know what it looks like. But it has everything to do with your future. Because where you are right now in life is called the ellipsis. ... That's where you are right now. Like, yeah, but I think I'm at the end of my story. I'm getting close to the end of my story. No, you're still in the ellipsis. Story's not wrapped up yet. What can God do with your past, with your relationships, with your hurt? What can he provide as far as healing to rewrite your story during the ellipsis? Because the ellipsis, that ... is where you are right now. So what you do with life right now determines your future. See, I told you I was going to preach a sermon about your future. I just don't know what it looks like. My life, I don't know what my future looks like either. But I do know it will be determined by how I live my life right now during the ellipsis. Stupid title? Not in my opinion. For me, that title right there, I have poured my heart over that this week because I realized it's all about me, isn't it? I am preaching to myself. That happens a lot to me. And if I have to go through it, so do you. And so I present it to you. But believe me, it's the most important part of your life is right now, the ellipsis. Change the outcome of your story by giving the ellipsis over to God.